Hi, everyone, and welcome back. It's time for Summer of Drawing again, and we're going to be talking about colored pencils today. So I want to just dive right in and get started, but I will say if you don't have colored pencils on hand, don't worry. You can still draw along with all the exercises just using pencil and paper. We'll be going over a lot of information about color and colored pencils, so you can store it all up for when you decide you'd like to give it a try yourself. I'm going to go ahead and screen share. All right. Welcome back to Summer of Drawing, and we're on class number 15, Colored Pencils, Plants and Fruit. So colored pencils, what are they? We've talked about a number of different types of pencils, and we've covered, charcoal and Conte crayon, different kinds of lead pencils. So colored pencils have a core that they're usually wax or oil-based and contain various different pigments, binding agents, which hold them together, other additives, secret formulas, that sort of thing. So there's a great variety of color. There are many, many different brands. There is also a variety of quality. And usually the more expensive pencils tend to have more pigment in them, which makes them a little bit more fun to draw with. You can use the sort that you can get, inexpensively at the drugstore. It's not like you can't, but you'll find that building up the layers of color might be more difficult. So I thought that this was really interesting, that the use of wax-based media in crayons can be traced back to the Greek Golden Age. That's pretty cool. I mean, we tend to think of colored pencils as something very recent, and that's really because, from the early 1900s, that's when colored pencils started to be used more popularly in the way that we see it now. And in fact, there is almost no subject that is beyond the use of colored pencils. So I'm going to show you a few artists today, but we're not going to do an extensive tour, because if you just Google colored pencil art or colored pencil drawing, you'll see that every subject matter can be drawn with colored pencils. All right, so this is just a little photo I did a while back showing one of my sort of like a roll of colored pencils that I can easily carry with me, and a few little drawings that I did that I'll be talking about today. So I use colored pencil, as a very relaxing thing to do. I'm usually not trying to do something large like a painting or a big finished piece, but I've seen some fantastic stuff that has been done that way. So I'm just sort of going to show you how to do what I do, and then you can take it from there. So techniques, when you're drawing with colored pencil, it's a little bit different. You think about paint and you think about, I'm going to mix this color and this color to get that color. Well, with colored pencils, you have all of these different colors available, many, many reds and greens and blues. And in part, that's because they don't mix well together. It's not as if you can, somehow join the two pencils and get the color that you want. What you do instead is you put one layer on top of another, and you sort of very lightly pencil one layer of one color, one layer of another color, and you get an optical illusion of both of those colors together. So an example would be, if I wanted green and I didn't have a green available, or I wanted a different type of green, I could put yellow down and blue very lightly over it, or the reverse and get a slightly different green. And so that would be my way of mixing colored pencils. So layering, thin layers, thin being the operative word, thin layers of colored pencil are drawn on top of each other to create shading, extend the color range, and create a drawing with brilliance, because it's sort of the same effect you get from an impressionist painting, where all of that color next to each other sort of vibrates and makes it very interesting to look at. Now, burnishing is a blending technique. You can either use a light colored pencil over the top, or a colorless blender, or people even use sort of smooth sticks and that sort of thing with a piece of paper over top of the drawing. And what they're doing is they're blending. They're sort of pushing down hard on these layers of colored pencil and sort of pushing them all together, smushing them all together, and making kind of a sheen to the top of the drawing. This is something that you definitely do at the very last stage, because it's very difficult to draw on top of that. But this is a technique to kind of really bring the color out. Scoring is something that's done if you have a thicker paper. You might, before you even start drawing, you might score some lines in by using some sort of tool and a piece of paper protecting the good piece of paper that you're going to draw on, making lines in the paper in some sort of pattern. And then you're going to do the colored pencil over the top in such a way that those areas that you sort of embossed don't get colored pencil in them. So what has happened over the years is that people have developed some very specific ways and techniques for drawing with colored pencil. Now, personally, I do very little burnishing and I do very little scoring. And I don't do any fusing, which is this last thing, which is using solvents or a colorless blender to mix pigments together on the paper. But these are fun things to try and experiment. And I have definitely experimented with all of them. I tend to like, myself, a little bit of that texture of the colored pencil and the texture of the paper. So I don't want to get rid of all of that. But people who do very photorealistic, very, very realistic drawings tend to really like that business of being able to sort of eliminate the idea of what created it, that it was a colored pencil. So some tips. Cross-hatching is very useful. We all know all about cross-hatching, hatching going one way, cross-hatching coming back the other way. Helps you build up the layers slowly so that you're not putting too much colored pencil down. Because especially if you're using the waxier Prismacolor pencils, which I use a lot, if you go too heavy with those initial layers, it is very difficult to get top layers to lay down on top. So it's good, especially in the early stages, to be letting a little bit of that paper still be there. Very much like the silver point situation, where with silver points, you needed the ground there to be able to pick up the silver point. In this case, you need to still have some paper or something with some tooth to pick up the colored pencil. Work with a good point on your pencil. So for me, I bought an electric pencil sharpener. If you haven't seen my materials list of Elizabeth's favorite materials, it's on my website, www.elizabethwhelan.com. On the art classes page, it'll say Elizabeth's favorite materials, and it's a PDF you can download. And I'm pretty sure I listed the particular type of electric pencil sharpener I use. Now, I do that just because it's easy. And there was a time in my art career where I was doing an awful lot of colored pencil work. And so it was just, put the pencil in there, I'd get a good point. It wouldn't break the Prismacolor. I was all set. But you can definitely still, you can sharpen by hand, you can sharpen with a knife or with a razor blade. You can do all of those things still. The leads do tend to be, the cores, I guess they're not really lead, they do tend to be somewhat brittle. And so that's why I went for a very sort of fast electric pencil sharpener. If you find yourself doing a lot of colored pencil, you may decide that you need to do something like that as well, because it will give you a nice point and it won't break the lead. But the reason why that you want that tip is that if you have a very blunt end to your pencil and you're trying to get some detail and you're trying to get an even finish, you'll be fighting against that pencil quite a bit. Now, I have developed over time, and a lot of people in drafting, for example, know how to do this as well. This technique of sort of slightly turning your pencil in your fingers. I have a pencil, so I can show you how I do it. Well, I'll do it with the end of a brush here. So all I do is, as I'm drawing, I'm sort of every now and again just sort of slightly turning that pencil as I go, and it helps keep a point for a lot longer. So these are little techniques that you'll start to pick up. Using a durable paper is really useful. Now you can use colored pencil on anything. You can use it on copier paper, printer paper. It doesn't matter. You can use sketchbook paper. But if you're going to get in there and start burnishing and blending and scoring and doing all of these other things, you'll want a paper that can take that. And so there are some very good quality watercolor and drawing papers that say that they're good for colored pencil, or just if they have a good weight to them. A thicker paper, not a thinner paper. It will help quite a bit in terms of actually being able to abuse the paper in the way that you need to get the artwork to look like you want it to. So let's see. Oh yes, the last tip is watercolor. So you might not have thought of this before, but in order to sort of give yourself a jump start, kind of, do a few steps ahead, you could lay down watercolor or a very, very thin acrylic wash for your first layers, particularly if you've got a large background or something that you're going to have to do. And boom, you've got some color right away, so that when the next layer goes down, it'll still adhere to the paper like it's supposed to, but you will have saved yourself a layer or two of actually coloring with colored pencil. So this is a really good technique, and one that if you're doing a larger painting can be really useful. What you want to be sure of, especially if you're going to try with acrylic, is to not use anything like a medium that allows it to get slick. You still want the tooth of the paper to come through. So just a couple of pieces of artwork by people whose work I really admire. So Marco Mazzoni does these fantastic colored pencil pieces. He tends to really like these organic and sea and plants, and the people that he does are sort of integrated with all of the same kinds of things. He does a lot of portraiture, and his I don't know if he has a website, but I do know his Instagram. So if you're interested in checking out his work, it's really lovely, and it really draws on, no pun intended, the unique qualities of colored pencil to be able to do these kinds of blending. You can do so much. It's almost like painting. So colored pencil itself is very portable. People really enjoy using it because you don't have to take paint and water or solvent or whatever, and you can still get these wonderful, wonderful effects. But I will tell you that colored pencil is relatively time consuming. So it's not as if you're going to be able to sit yourself down at a busy cafe and suddenly produce something like Marco has here. You might get a preliminary sketchy drawing down, but it takes time and it takes thought to actually go through and do a beautiful piece of art. So here's another incredible piece. This is by an artist named Mary Carlson, and it's called Night Glow. And if you go to the Colored Pencil Society of America website, and there are other organizations as well that specialize in colored pencil, and look through some of the exhibits, or this was from an international show, the work is fantastic. It's really phenomenal. And you can see here some of the various subject matter that is really popular, and people really like plants and they like succulents and things like that. But there's also this ability to get these nice darks. Look at all the color, for example, in the darks, all that bluey purple, the nice contrast with the green, and the detail. This is 10.5 by 8.5, so it's not very large, but there's a great deal of detail in there. And here's another piece. This is by Carmen Olson, and it's called Nature's Kaleidoscope. Now, this is another thing that is really excellent about working with colored pencil, is that you can often push the boundary of color as we see it in the real world. Sometimes when it comes to painting, it's difficult to decide how you're going to do that. With colored pencil, because you build up these layers over time, it gives you an opportunity to sort of get a little experimental and see what you can do with things that you see. So I'm sure this was based either on real life or a photograph, but she's obviously taken this quite a bit further than what we just think of as leaf color. Just really beautiful. And here's another piece, this one by Mary Hansen, and it's called Weathered. And this is quite large, 18 by 24. And just a really incredible study of this piece of wood and wonderful patterns. You know, a little bit of lichen there, and this gorgeous moth, just really beautiful. So you can see just from those few pieces that you can do basically anything that you want to in colored pencil. So it's a matter of how do you do it? How do you get started? And that's what we're going to talk about next. So we're going to take a little bit of discussion about color before we get into how to actually use these colored pencils. And so I want you to just look at this for a minute. So when you initially look at this lemon, the first thing you probably think of is, okay, it's a lemon. It's yellow and it's sitting on a white surface and there's a white board there, because that is the kind of information that our brain sends to us. So as artists, we have to sort of, push back on that a little bit. And we have to say, okay, yes, it's yellow. And, we know that those boards are white. But if we really start to look at this, the first thing we can tell is that the board behind the lemon is actually a gray. And in fact, the board under the lemon is also a gray. They're two different values. And once we start actually looking around the lemon, not necessarily even at the lemon, you start to see there's a little bit of a yellow glow behind the lemon up on the wall, let's call it the wall. And then on the floor underneath, you can see how there's a yellowish tinge. And then as it gets closer in underneath the lemon, it's almost a reddish tinge. And then there's this sort of, if you look out to the right-hand end of the shadow, you could almost say it's a little bit more blue. So this is an interesting phenomenon, and it's something that I want you to start looking for. And that is something called overtones. When something that you look at has the overtones of either blue or red or yellow. And it'll only be those three colors, although you can say, well, something is greenish or purplish and this, that, and the other. But to start with, I want you to start looking at things and go, you know, what kind of overtone does something have? And it might, if I tell you that initially, you're like, oh no, panic. What is she talking about? This is a sensitivity to looking at objects for color that you will develop over time. For the moment, just take my word for it. And then as we get to the end of the class, I'll bet you start seeing more color in things. So one of the things I look at, for example, is object A compared to object B. Is it bluer or redder or yellower? So if I look at the wall and I look down on the right-hand side, you know, to the right of the lemon, I would say that area of the wall down, you know, near the fold is bluer. It has a bluer tinge, a blue overtone. Whereas if I get back towards the lemon, it has a yellow overtone. Now let's look at the lemon itself. So one of the things that we see, if we kind of squint a little bit and try to remove the concept of lemon from our heads, because I know that gets in the way of everything. What we start to see is this sort of darkish pattern running across the lemon. And we have a highlight, then we have bright yellow, then we have this sort of darkish patch. And then it goes back to a lighter yellow underneath, not quite as bright as the top. And then there's almost a reddish rim around the bottom. So let's look at these colors just a little bit. So we've said, okay, it looks like there's a reddish rim a little bit at the bottom, which corresponds with where the red shading is underneath the lemon. And if we look down towards the right, there's like a green tip, and then there's kind of an orangey, kind of a reddish overtone there to the end of the lemon. Then it gets kind of greeny blue, doesn't it? And then it gets sort of orangey, maybe orangey brown again. And now we start getting more yellow, a little bit, maybe yellow green even. And then we've got the highlight, and then we've got marks on the lemon, which are various different colors. So what is happening here? So I've just described it, and you're like, oh my gosh, what's she talking about? I see all these colors, but I don't know what to do with that. Don't panic, don't panic. We're kind of backing into the color theory business. But what I'm interested in you starting to look around in the world in general is ask yourself when you see something like this, why? Why is it like this? So we have a light, right? And the light is shining in from the left at the top, and that's why we have that highlight. And the lemon is blocking the light, which is why we get the shadow, because the shadow is where light can't get to. If light could get underneath there, it would be as light as what we're calling the floor, basically. Likewise, the lemon is up against the wall, and so some of that shadow is cast onto the wall. And actually, you can see that there are a few different light bulbs, and that's why there are numerous shadows that are actually sort of all overlapping. Is because there's more than one light source coming down, but in about the same direction, which gives us the one highlight. So what happens then? And this is, so what happens a lot of time if people go, okay, lemon, highlight, shadow, done. But if you do that in color, and even if you do it in black and white, you're missing a lot of information. Because to begin with, what happens when the light hits all of that white is it bounces around. It bounces off the lemon, it bounces back down onto the board, it bounces up to underneath the lemon again. And that's how we get those reflected lights, is what they're called. That lighter yellow area that's below the dark band that runs across the middle of the lemon, that lighter area is light bouncing back up onto the lemon from the rest of the floor, basically. And that is also why some of the shadow is lighter than the rest of the shadow, because although that darkest bit underneath the lemon is quite dark, everywhere else in that shadow, other light is bouncing back to greater or lesser degree, which gives these shadows these gradations. So shadows don't just have gradations, and objects don't just have gradations for no reason whatsoever. It's because of how the light falls on something. And so not only does that create the shading that we see, as the form of the lemon turns, less light is getting all around it, but then boom, we get some light reflecting back up off the ground, which creates a lighter area underneath. So we have that, but we also have color being affected. So in this particular case, for whatever reason, probably to do with the skin of the lemon, as we're seeing it get darker underneath, it's bringing out a reddish orange tinge, and that color is being reflected back onto what would be the white ground, but because we're seeing it very dark because it's in shadow, we're seeing this sort of darkish red right underneath the lemon, and then we see it get a little yellow. Can you start to see now, and maybe even more if you squinted it, how the shadow itself is actually a yellowish green color. Now, I bet when you first looked at that, you didn't notice that at all, but now you can see it pretty clearly. And likewise, now you can probably see that over to the slightly behind the lemon, by the wall where there's that yellow glow, there's also almost like a very light center to that. There's almost like a little glow that goes on. So starting to look for this information is really important. When you're working with colored pencils or painting or anything like that, being able to observe these small color changes and put this stuff down accurately will give your work life. And that way you won't just be coloring a big old lemon and putting a dark shadow under and calling it a day. So let's take that one step further. 2 objects, woohoo! Okay, so now I bet you're really seeing it, aren't you? You're seeing that there's some gradation to the wall behind. You can see how there's a little bit of subtle, like bluer over on one side, maybe a little reddish, and then maybe a little yellow in the middle. Kind of hard to see. You can really see underneath these shadows how the reflected light from the lemon is making the lemon shadow more yellow than the shadow underneath the green apple. You can definitely see the closer the objects that have color are to the shaded area, the more intense the color is, and then it dissipates as they go out. And then now you've got something else interesting happening. You've got the light that's bouncing around is bouncing from the green apple onto the lemon. And you can really see the greenish edge on the right-hand side of that lemon. And you can see a little bit, not quite so much, a little bit how the yellow lemon is bouncing back on the green, but the green is kind of overpowering. What you do see on both of these is you see that the light from the floor is bouncing back up and creating sort of a light area underneath both the apple and the lemon. So what's happening is you've got light on the top, the highlight. You've still got light going around the top of the objects. As the light can't get to the sides, it gets darker, but then light bouncing up from the bottom is making the bottoms lighter. So reflected light from the surface and reflected color from the objects around. So take it to another object, and here we've got another situation where we can see the color and the shadows underneath quite clearly. We can't see an awful lot of the red on the lemon because it's sort of turned around. It's on the back side. There's a little teeny bit of on the left-hand side of the lemon, you can see a little bit of the color there. But one thing that's interesting is that you can start to see how color that is in one object can also be used in another object to sort of tie them together. So if we look at these 2 objects and we look at underneath the lemon, how there's that reddish tinge that we now can see pretty clearly. Well, if I take a little of that red of the pepper and use it under the lemon, and then maybe use a little of that same red, maybe to make some of those orangish patches, and then maybe use a little of the yellow of the lemon, in the shadow area underneath the pepper, because it's not all red, is it? It's kind of got some sort of an off gray color. And then use maybe that same yellow, where the pepper sort of bulges out. You can see it's got kind of a brighter area there. Maybe use a little of the yellow there and then yellow to help make the green. Now you're starting to unify a drawing together. And this is what colored pencils excel at. They are really good for using in this way because quite frankly, it takes a long time to do colored pencil, all of these layers and thinking it out. So it gives you an opportunity to play color back and forth. So I said we were sort of backing into color theory because I'm going to use some terms, not a lot today, to describe what we're going to be doing. So you've got the primary colors. Everybody knows yellow, red, and blue. And I've been talking about looking for overtones of those colors and things because it'll help you with your colored pencil drawing. But the other thing that we're going to be interested in are these things called complementary colors. And a complementary color is just basically right across the circle from the primary color. And what a complementary color does is when you add those two together, it dulls down the other color. So if I add a little orange to blue, I get a sort of a duller, darker blue, kind of starts to get a little brownish color. If I add red to green, I'll start to get a darker green, kind of it'll go maybe a little olivish, or a little bit, I don't even know what the name of the color is. It goes darker. And likewise, you add a little bit of green to the red, you're starting to, head towards some darker, richer reds. Now, they're not the same type of reds that you would get by adding purple or adding blue, which definitely gives you those purplish. But what happens is when you add complements to each other, you start dulling down and darkening the color without adding black. And this is what's really important because what we want to do, black is not like the evil color. People say, don't use black, la, la, la. I think black is fine to use. But by using some of the complementary colors to dull down colors rather than always heading for black, you'll get an interesting range to your drawing. And the other secret with colored pencils is by using complementary colors underneath the brighter colors when you get started, you'll add a great deal of depth to your drawing. And actually the same goes for painting as well. So this is why I'm so keen to show it to you. So how does it work in real life? Well, I did this little layout of some Prismacolor colors. I just picked a bunch. It wasn't really all that careful. A couple of greens, a couple of blues, violet, this, that, and the other. And then my two favorite, Tuscan Red and Indigo Blue. Now, if you don't have Prismacolor, you might have, these might be called something else, but basically Tuscan Red is just a very dark reddish brown, and Indigo Blue is a dark kind of bluey black. And quite frankly, any color in that sort of range underneath will work. I use these two colors a lot to establish my darks up front, just like I would when I was doing a graphite drawing, to get that color underneath, to get things started. And then using complementary colors, here are some examples in these little cubes I did. So on the top of the cube, I just very lightly used a color, blue or green or yellow, just pure. Then I went a little heavier on both sides. And then I added to that a little bit of the complementary color and also a little bit of the adjacent color. So you would often think, okay, I'm going to make yellow a little darker. I'll use orange. That makes sense, right? And it does. But if you want to get a little more punch out of it, then a little tiny bit of purple or lavender just takes it that one step further. On the green one, you see the same kind of thing. I've got green and I can add blue. That's interesting. But if I add a tiny bit of orange, which is a tiny bit of red, then I get a little bit more depth to that green. So all of these colors it's not like some sort of miracle thing that happens, but you can use them subtly like this, or you can use them quite strongly in both your painting and your drawing. But I wanted to show you sort of how it works when you just use it subtly. It just sort of gives you, rather than just relying on, hey, I'm going to use yellow and orange and then black. By using yellow and orange and a little bit of purple, which just sort of dulls down that yellow, you really extend the range of the types of colors that you're using. So, oops, why do we have this one again? I'm not quite sure. Okay, so what I did with this information was I decided I better sketch you something. So I'm just going to lead you through what I did. I had this little picture of this hens and chickens plant, and I thought I would sketch something which actually isn't quite accurate because I put an extra layer of those little petals in there. But what I did want to do is I wanted to kind of get that nice core, and I wanted to extend the range. I didn't want to just use green, green and red, because that wasn't going to cut it. It wasn't going to give me all the colors I wanted. So what I did was I used a lot of these colors, these Prismacolors I have listed here, but I also used the complements, the complementary colors, and I'm going to show you what the sort of the steps I went through. So when I did this, I also did another quick version just using like a beige toned paper, just to show you that color pencil actually stands up pretty well to the lighter toned papers, and it's really quite fun. So you do want to test your colors and find out for your colored pencils what happens when you layer colors over each other, when you press more lightly, when you press more heavier. Test which colors look better, whether you put one over the top, like if I put green over yellow, does it work better than if I put yellow over green? What do I end up with? And I want to just say right now, not all colors need to be colored everywhere on each layer. So this is something really important to think about, that when you put the layers down on a leaf or a petal or whatever, you only have to put that color down where you really think it needs to go, where you actually see yellowish overtones or reddish overtones or blue or green or whatever. You don't have to color the entire thing over and over again. I think this is something that people have a tendency to do when they start layering, is they layer every color everywhere, and then it just doesn't have any oomph to it, doesn't have any sort of vibrance. So you want to think that each layer is going on top of each other layer, but each layer doesn't have to be the same shape. But what you want in the end is to sort of have some unity. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is just sort of sketch along with this. I'm just going to lead you through, I think it's 4 stages. And these are just sort of the preliminary stages that you can use when you are doing plants and that sort of thing that have a lot of green in them. So I've got this basil here. It's a very complicated looking bunch of leaves. And all I would like you to do is just draw a leaf-like shape that emulates one of these leaves, just to draw along for this particular exercise, because this is not to, how to draw a basil leaf. You can look at this later if you really want to see that, but this is how to put some of those base layers down so you get some depth. Because what happens otherwise, you've got, 3 or 4 greens maybe, and a couple of yellows, and they're just not the range to get that dark and light, to go all the way from that dark green to the lighter green. So I'll show you what I do. So just go ahead and take a couple of minutes just to sketch out a leaf and maybe the veins and, some sort of shape. Like I said, don't worry about it actually being a basil leaf. And the next step after that, keep it small because it's just a quick exercise. The next step after that is, what I do is I take those 2 colors I say that I love so much, and if it's a green object, red is the complement, right? Red's across the color wheel. Then where I want the green to be the darkest, I put some red underneath it, because that's where I really want there to be a differentiation. Now, notice I don't put red everywhere. I don't cover the whole thing with red. I'm really kind of careful about how I do these underlayers. And then I come back with a little bit of blue. And I can put the blue over the top of the red. That's fine. But I also extend the blue a little bit more. And you'll see that in the next step. The blue is going to make that mid-range green. The red and the blue make the darkest green underneath. So just trust me on this, just follow along. So on your sketch, go ahead and put some red, some dark red, where you see darkest, or where you would like it to be the darkest on your leaf. And then start adding a little bit of blue where you see the next darkest areas. So I'm just going to show you the next picture so you'll know what I'm talking about. So the goal is to make a range of dark greens that are not relying on just using a dark green colored pencil. So this is what I end up with. This is where I get to next. I haven't even put a single green down, have I? Not one. What I'm doing is I'm establishing those underlayers, kind of like what you might for painting, where you're putting down these rich basic colors. You're sort of drawing the structure, and you're doing it in a way that the colors underneath will sort of mix through the layers that you put down on top. So you can see here that everywhere it was that I want it very dark, I had a good layer of red down, and now I've put a really good layer of blue on top of that. But then I've got some light red and light blue that I've put to make the whole shape of the leaf. And I'm just going to page back for a second so you can see that again. So I started with a pencil sketch. Now I put down red, and some of it's lighter and some of it's darker. And then I put down blue, and some of that's lighter and some of it's darker. But can you see how the blue and the red are sometimes in different places? So this is what I meant, that when you put your layers down, you can be different about them. Okay, so hopefully by now you've put down some blue on top of your red. We're just going to move right on because this is just a quick exercise. You could draw very carefully. This probably took me maybe an hour to do because colored pencil can take a while. So now I'm doing something that you might consider kind of odd. Like, why have I still not put any green down? Why did I go for the yellow? So what I find with colored pencil is that it's very useful right about now to do what I call reserving the highlights. And that is basically, I have figured out where the lightest area is. And on the basil, it's going to be like yellow is about the lightest you can get on here. You could pick out the white highlights as well, but I'm not doing that in this case. I'm just saying, I just want to show the sort of the undulations of the basil leaf. And so what I'm doing is I am making sure that that I'm not going to just color over that at a late stage and then have everything too dark, because it's very difficult to go backwards with colored pencil. You can scrape things out and such, but it's not easy to do. So you definitely want to think, that you're going to be careful about sort of preserving those highlight areas and those lighter areas. And I do that by using, whether it's a yellow or a light blue or a light orange or whatever it is for whatever I happen to be drawing. I go ahead and I get those highlights down, those highlight areas. And then in this particular case, I do sort of blend it out a little bit, because what I actually want to have happen is I want not necessarily yellow highlights. I want yellowy green highlights. So I want a good deal of yellow down. So when I put the green over the top, it maintains a lighter form. So then what I did after that, and it took me a few layers to do it. It's not like I did it just in one. I went ahead and started adding in my greens, and I used maybe 2 or 3 greens. I did use a dark green. I probably used a bluey green. I used a yellowy green to try to, to keep that feeling of the bumpy leaf. And then I left some of it graphite because this was more than enough trouble right here. But because of this, because I went through all these stages, and I didn't take this to the point of, like getting to the point where everything is covered up, like where I've covered everything with colored pencil and burnishing and this, that, and the other. I like to stop right about here. But by doing this, I got an awful lot more of a range out of my colored pencils than I would if I started the other way. And so if you want to test that principle, you can try it. Try just using only your greens and yellow and try to get the same range that you do by doing those underlayers. And you'll see why I'm so sold on this. So you can use purples underneath, you can use blues underneath, you can use browns and reds, you can use black, you can use, dark greens under oranges, you can use complementary colors everywhere you can. So on this particular iris, I did the same thing, but I was very, 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 very light-handed with the Tuscan Red and the indigo blue. I mean, I talk about holding the pencil at the very, very end, and being very, very careful, because it's yellow can easily be overwhelmed by Tuscan Red and indigo blue or any of those darker colors. So I wanted, once again, the variation. I mean, yellow, right? What am I going to do with it? Yellow, it can be a little greeny, it can be a little bit orange, but I wanted more than that. I wanted more color. And so I would just very, very carefully on the undersides where those petals flipped over, I put some very, very light areas of Tuscan Red and indigo blue, and I think probably a little purple and stuff in there too. And I did the same thing going down the stem, but I wanted the delicacy of the flower, right? So I didn't go quite as crazy as I did with the succulent. So now I'm going to show you that step by step of the succulent, and you can just sort of watch this and see how it goes. because we'll be doing something similar to this shortly. So there isn't really just one way. There isn't one way to go about this. And sometimes I start kind of in the middle, and sometimes I start at the beginning like I did on the basil. And I wanted to show this to you because I don't want you to think there's some sort of formulaic way to go about colored pencil. In this particular case, I wanted to draw this little guy down here. And so I started with light blue. I didn't use graphite this time. And I decided I wanted to kind of figure out where some of those bluer greens were going to be, and then where some of those pinky bits underneath the petals needed to be. And after that, I sort of pulled in, I said, well, there's an orangish tone here that I don't want to get lost. So I'm going to look for that orangish tone and put that down right away as well. From that, I then backed up and said, okay, where's my Tuscan red and where's my, where is my indigo blue going to go? Because I want to get those in. And I started doing a little bit more of that, drawing out the darker areas, figuring out where that was going to go. Finally, once I got that sort of sorted out, finally I started putting some green in. So I started in this particular case, I saw there were two kind of greens mostly. There was a yellowy green at the bottom, and then there's sort of a bluey green at the top. So I'm continuing to sort of add color. In this particular case, what I did also was I brought in some orange at this particular point because I really wanted to try to accentuate that red bit, down at the bottom and kind of get that feeling of glow. So I'm adding other colors in. I decided I needed to do something better with the, the kind of the way that the stalk comes up close to the flower, that needed to be better defined. Now I'm doing a little bit more. I've added a little bit more green, a little bit more color. The stem business at the bottom, I've decided that needed to have more color as well. And then finally, I got to the point where I'm going back over all of those different layers. I added a little bit of bluey green in there. I keep bumping up all the color as I go. And I decided that I'd gone too far with the business of that stem around, the encasement around the flower. And I actually, at this point, took an X-Acto knife and just sort of slightly scraped out a little bit of the color. And then I put a little bit more of that kind of veining back in. And I thought to myself, okay, that took me about a half hour to do. I kind of knew where I was going with it, but you can see sort of how building all those colors in got me to something that has a lot of depth to it. So that was a lot of fun. So what I'd like you to do right now, just for a few minutes before we get to a longer drawing project, which we'll finish up the class today with, is just to look at these grapes for a minute. So you might think, before, okay, I'm going to draw some purple grapes and I'm going to, here's some green leaves. But now, based on what we've been talking about and what you've seen is possible with colored pencil, you can probably start to see all of the places that interesting color could be used. How you could put a red underneath, or even an orange underneath, or a blue underneath, or a pink underneath some of these grapes to get different colors. How there are some green areas, actually the reflection of the light coming through the leaves is actually putting a little bit of a greenish glow on the left-hand side of some of these grapes. Likewise, you're seeing, from below and from the brown stalk, some darker colors are reflecting back on the right hand side. In fact, if you squint and look at this bunch of grapes, you can really see how there's a light sort of center to the bunch, and how it gets much darker on the right hand side and almost as dark on the left. So all of these things can be brought into play while you're actually doing something like this in colored pencil. So with colored pencil, you want to make a little bit of a plan. It's kind of difficult to get in there and just sort of start drawing, not knowing what you're doing. But once again, establishing those darks, just like I have told you for some other of the types of drawing that we've been doing, establishing those darks, not going too dark, not going too crazy, but figuring out a little bit of how you would handle the color. So if I were doing these, and these are the sort of bluish purple, I would probably put both the Tuscan red and the indigo blue in those shadows. But I also might start thinking about how could I use maybe either a greenish color or a complementary color like orange to start changing, adding a little variety to to these grapes. And I might decide that for those grapes that are more in the shadow, going around the edges, where I want the color a bit duller, that might be a very good place to do a little bit of undercolor in orange, in that complementary color, to sort of dull down the blue. So what I would do before I did that is just like that sketch I did earlier. I would actually test it out to the side, figure out how heavy do you need to press in order to get the right color combination. So these are all this is the basic information to get you started with colored pencil. And what we're going to do now is spend the rest of the class just drawing something, that you can get started. You'll start to see the color in it, and hopefully you can continue this on your own time. And now that we have this groundwork laid, I'm going to show you next week how to sort of take it to the next step and how to do slightly more elaborate color scenes. But in the meantime, if possible, if you can practice this a little bit, it would be really helpful. Now, if you're just drawing along with pencil and paper and don't have colored pencils and don't want to try that, I would still like you, when you get this image in the PDF afterwards, and if you're looking at the video later, you can go to my website on the art classes page and download the PDF that has these images, and try to draw these grapes and these leaves using all of the values, the lights and darks that you see, and try to get that same feeling of a bunch of grapes. And look at every single one of them is a different value. It's really complicated. And try, see how well you can do that. All right, so we've got, I think, one more item to look at. Sorry, I thought we were right there ready to draw. I just wanted to also show you, if you're taking any of your own pictures or setting up your own item in order to draw it, something that's really useful is to vary the light or vary the color of what's underneath the object. So this is a way, for example, to take basil leaves and get a lot more color out of them in order for you to draw. So in this case, if you were to use this as an exercise that you did this week, I would pick just one leaf, lightly sketch in graphite, use dark blue and a dark red under those areas in the darkest color, then a yellow to put down those highlights, and then proceed to to add the greens. This would be a really good exercise to do. And here's the one that we're going to end up the class with. So we don't have a ton of time, but I would like you to spend a good 10 minutes on this. So as you're working along, I'm just going to point out some items on this. So first of all, don't worry about drawing out the whole scene, right? We're just going to concentrate on this really great, I think it's a mushroom, or is it a toadstool? I'm not sure. Somebody can tell me. But really beautiful, isn't it? So one of the first things you probably see is that there's some really great reflected lights that are sort of blues in the shadows. Now, those could be coming from who knows, objects around. That could be the bluey green of the ground. The photographer could have enhanced the photo a little bit, I'm not sure, but whatever it is, it's lovely. And you can probably also see the sort of a bluish cast underneath the right-hand side of those gills underneath. So in the time we have, just go ahead and sketch out the general shape. And if you're using colored pencils, go ahead and use, a dark red and a dark blue to establish some of those areas where you might want the color to be darkest. So that might be around this little frilly thing around the middle of the stem. It might be down near the base. It could be, for example, where those gills are underneath, whether they're darker, maybe a little bit of that indigo blue or a bluish color right there, as well as a little bit of Tuscan red to sort of establish how that's going to go. And likewise, within the dip, where you've got the darker red, maybe a little bit of bluish color under that red would be useful, or maybe a little bit of greenish color under that red, just to sort of test it out. So one of the things that often happens is when people get to these lighter areas, like over on the right, the left, where it's very bright, and then over on the right, where you've got kind of a peachy color, I would strongly suggest that this is where you start thinking about what you're doing with your background, and that you establish the edges of this mushroom with the idea that you're going to use some of a darker value, greenish blue or greeny blue and brown, maybe some abstraction. Good place to use some abstraction, just around the edges not all, that doesn't have to be all over the place, but to establish where those lighter areas are, and likewise the lighter areas of the stem. So in other words, the edge of the stem, the edge of the gills, is actually created, you probably have put a little graphite line, but is actually created by the dark coming up to it. Like I said, you wouldn't want to necessarily draw dark all over the page. That's not really necessary, but it is really useful figuring out how to add in just a little bit of background to set off the subject. So as you're looking at this, you're probably seeing even more color. So there's some reflected orange color coming down at the top of the stem, and then it goes to yellow, and then it kind of turns into a light blue. Then it goes to a little bit lighter, then blue again. Then we got some more yellowy color in here. So this is the sort of thing that as you're working in colored pencil, you don't have to think, oh, I only have to do it this way. I can't start with the light color. I can't start with this. You can start anywhere you want to. And like I say so often, just start with what looks easy. What do you see? Just go ahead with that. With those darker colors that I'm so fond of, Tuscan Red and Indigo Blue, it is definitely easier to put those down early on, very lightly. But all of these colors, just like I did with that little succulent, I started kind of in the middle, didn't I? With the blues and the pinks, because I wanted to get those colors down. And that would be perfectly fine to do here. To maybe get the oranges and the blue down first, or whatever order you feel like working in, whatever you see. Now, as you get better and better at this, you will start to be able to use some of those other techniques to really emphasize certain things about a subject like this. For example, after you had drawn out your graphite, you might go back in if you were using some heavier paper, and you might do that business of scoring the paper so that there were little divots where all those gills are. And that way, as you color over the top, those white gills will remain. So there's a very good place to do something like that. You could even do it for the little white bits on the top. Another interesting sort of technique or combination of techniques to try is to do something, for example, where you would burnish. In other words, you get to the all your color down. You've got a ton of color on the top of the mushroom there, and now you're going to either come back with maybe like a yellow or a light orange, or even just put a piece of copier paper over the top and take the back of your thumb and just sort of rub over the top of that mushroom so that those colors kind of blend together. So there's a difference in texture between the rest of your drawing and some sort of focal point. So these are things to play around with. And I highly, if you've got to the end of the drawing and you did a really good job and you really like this mushroom and it looks really great, but then, and you're like, should I burnish or should I not? I would strongly suggest that over at the side of your paper, on another paper, you just do a little bit of a, little quick recreation of what you've just done, and then try burnishing that. Likewise, when it comes to using solvents or using blending pencils or any of the other things that are available for colored pencil, what happens is they will change the way the drawing looks. And so you then have to decide, do I want my whole drawing to be changed in that way? And if I do that, will I lose the crispness or will I lose the texture? Or shall I use this in one area and not in another? So these other ways, burnishing, solvents, blending, all of those things that you can do beyond just simple layering are to be experimented with, definitely, to try and see how they work. But I would use a little caution before suddenly, you've done this great drawing, before suddenly adding solvent to it and seeing that what happens is not what you expected. So let's go ahead and just sort of wrap up wherever you are on this. We've talked a lot today about, I've shown you all of these examples and steps. And what has to really happen now is for you to experiment a little bit by yourself. So when I send this PDF around to you, I would really like this week for you to go ahead and give this a try. Draw any of these things. You can, copy what I did, try this, try the basil leaf, any of these. And then you can email me with your questions if you run into any problems, because then I can maybe address those in next week's class. Or just know that whatever you're running into. We're going to try to take this a little bit further, talking about how color works next week, so that when you are using colored pencil, you'll have a little bit better idea how to proceed. So for next week, I am going to demonstrate what doing watercolor or a light acrylic wash underneath, how that helps, how that sort of moves you along. And I'm going to try another brand of colored pencil. This week I used Prismacolor just to see what the differences are. And I want to do that because investing in a large set of colored pencils is not an inexpensive thing to do. So we'll compare a little bit how these different brands work. I'm just picking the two, the Faber-Castell and the Prismacolor. So you can start having something, to evaluate to see how that goes. Okay, so let's move on here. All right, to wrap up just for today. So colored pencil, interesting colored pencil drawings are achieved by looking at all the colors you can see. And you can build up using underlayers of complementary colors. And so as you look around during the course of the week, I'd like you to look at things and try to figure out, if you were going to draw them in colored pencil, how would you do that? Can you see some reflected lights? Do you think some blue and red underneath might make some nice darker colors that your other colors can sit on? I would also say, take it easy on yourself. So the basil leaf that I drew initially, that was not the easiest thing to do because of all of those greens. The second basil leaf we looked at, that had the sort of the four, that was backlit, that was a lot easier because you can see now a range of colors. You can see things that you can do. So you might decide that if you want to try plants, and you want to try something that has a lot of greenery, you might actually want to put an orange or a red cloth or some other, or even blue, some other color underneath or some other color in the background, so that there is some reflected light, some color from whatever that other object is that will bounce off the leaves, the green leaves, and add some interest. One of the reasons I picked that little succulent thing to draw was because I knew it would work well for colored pencils because it had so many colors in it. So that is one way you can make it easy on yourself. Plants are really fabulous to do in colored pencil, but if we just do green stuff and don't figure out a way to add some color in there, it can make it actually quite difficult. So mess around with your colored pencils and see what they can do. Each brand layers a little differently. And do consider mixing in a little bit of graphite. There are lots of examples out there where people have added, done a drawing in graphite, and only part of it is done in colored pencil, and it is really, really effective. Look around for reflected light. You'll start seeing it everywhere. For example, you'll even see the colors of clothing that you wear, or if you have, you're holding your arm up and there's a yellow tablecloth or a red tablecloth underneath, you'll see the reflected light on your skin. Something really important to keep in mind for when you're painting people or when you're drawing people in colored pencil. And ask yourself, why? Why does the object look the way it does? Why does the shadow look the way it does? Why can I see color in that shadow? Why can I see color bouncing off a wall? Why has all of a sudden, we've got one light, but why do I see all that light underneath an object? And once you start realizing how objects block the light, how that creates the shadow, how light reflects off other objects to add color and to add interest, then when you need to actually draw something out of your head, perhaps you've got a beautiful still life and you want to add an eggplant to it. And you don't have an actual eggplant, but you have a photo. But you want that eggplant to look as if it belongs in your scene. You'll understand that, well, gosh, if that eggplant was sitting there, the reflected lights off these other objects would show up. If I add some of that color to my eggplant, this will look like it was all one scene. That kind of information is really, really useful when you're drawing and painting. So if you train yourself to start looking for that stuff now, it'll really help out. All right, super. I think we're at the end, so I'll stop screen sharing. And as per usual, I'll go ahead and send the PDF around. And if you're watching the video, you'll be able to go to my website and download the PDF with those images. So a lot of the things we've been doing this summer, it has been fine just to draw along in the class. And if you haven't had time during the week to actually do some more drawing, well, of course, there's the winter. It'll be winter of drawing. But in this particular case, even if you just draw little squares and add some of the complementary color or do a little bit of layering, just see how your colored pencils work. It'll help so much for what we're going to do next week. I hope that was a good overview of the basics of colors with complementary colors and how you can use underlayers in colored pencil. But the best way to figure out how to do it is actually just to practice. And if you're doing these classes just with a regular pencil and paper, go ahead and try drawing some of those subject matters and try to actually get your values really controlled so the lights and the darks really correspond with what you saw in those plants. All right, thanks so much. I really appreciate you being here today. I look forward to seeing you next week for the second half of colored pencils, drawing beautiful plants and fruit, although it might be vegetables as well next week. All right, talk to you then.